General Hospital spoilers reveal that Brad had always carried a quiet sense of unease, a nervous energy that lingered beneath every breath he took whenever he saw Jason and Britt growing closer again. It started subtly, like a faint tremor that only he could feel. But the more he watched their connection deepen, the more that tremor turned into a constant, suffocating pressure on his chest. It wasn't jealousy or bitterness. It was fear, raw, instinctive, gut-deep fear. Brad had lived long enough on the edges of the criminal underworld to recognize danger, even before it fully materialized. And he knew better than anyone that danger followed Jason Morgan like a shadow. Britt had survived enough chaos in her life, fought enough battles, lost enough innocence. She didn't deserve to be dragged once more into the crossfire of Jason's world. A world shaped by violence, retribution, and a kind of darkness that destroyed everything it touched if given enough time. The more Brad thought about it, the more unbearable it became to imagine Britt being targeted simply because of who she chose to love. Jason might have believed he could protect her from everything, but Brad understood the fatal flaw in that logic. People connected to Jason always became targets. No amount of loyalty, strength, or determination could erase the brutal truth that Jason's presence came with an invisible price, a cost that was often paid in blood, loss, and endless fear. Brad could still recall the times Britt came to him shaking after being followed, the moment she questioned whether she could ever have something resembling a normal life, and the way she tried so desperately to pretend she wasn't afraid. He had watched her pretend to be strong long enough to understand how deeply she was struggling beneath the surface. And now, watching her let Jason back into her heart again felt like watching her step willingly into the middle of a storm that was already gathering force. That storm grew even darker once Selina began to reveal certain whispers circulating in the underground. Selina didn't share details freely. She offered pieces, fragments, implications that only someone like Brad, someone used to surviving on scraps of information, could understand fully. And from those fragments, Brad pieced together a terrifying truth. New players were emerging, old enemies were resurfacing, and Port Charles was on the brink of another cycle of violence. Jason would be pulled into it without hesitation, because that was who he was. He didn't run from responsibility or danger, and he never turned his back on someone in need. But for Brad, that heroic instinct became a curse when it came to Britt. The more Jason got involved, the more Britt would be placed directly in the line of fire. No matter how hard he tried to shield her, Brad found himself awake at night imagining every worst-case scenario, every possibility of losing Britt because she trusted the wrong man at the wrong time. For a while, Brad tried to ignore the panic, hoping Jason and Britt's renewed connection was temporary, a passing moment fueled by nostalgia. But every time he saw Jason look at her with that quiet intensity, every time Britt's defenses crumbled just a little more, Brad realized he could no longer pretend. If Britt fell back into Jason's orbit completely, Brad feared she would never escape the fallout when violence inevitably found its way to their doorstep. The thought of losing the one friend who had stood by him through his mistakes and humiliations became unbearable. And so, he did the one thing he had promised himself he would never do. He began to consider using the secrets Selina had let slip over the years. Secrets powerful enough to wound Jason in ways he rarely allowed anyone to see. Brad did not relish the idea of threatening Jason. The very thought of it made his stomach twist. Jason was not just physically intimidating. He carried an emotional gravity that few people dared to challenge. His silence could cut deeper than any threat, and his loyalty once broken could never be repaired. But Brad convinced himself that if using those secrets could make Jason step away from Britt, even temporarily, then the risk was worth taking. Every instinct Brad possessed screamed that Britt's life would be safer if Jason kept his distance, and that belief slowly hardened into resolve. He began to analyze every scrap of information Selina had shared over the years: covert meetings, old alliances, buried favors, debts paid in shadows, moments where Jason had crossed lines even he preferred to forget. Brad didn't need to expose those secrets publicly. All he needed was for Jason to understand that Brad could do it if pushed far enough. The moment Brad finally confronted Jason, everything inside him vibrated with fear. He knew he was standing in front of a man who could break him without lifting a finger. Yet he forced himself to speak, to push past the heaviness in his chest, to make Jason realize that this was a line he didn't want Britt anywhere near. But as Brad began to allude to the secrets he held, he saw something shift in Jason's eyes, not anger, not aggression, but something far more unsettling. It was fear, but not fear for himself. It was fear for Britt, for what might happen if his world collided too violently with hers. Fear that Brad could make the wrong person aware of things that could endanger her even further. In that instant, Brad felt both vindicated and horrified. His plan was working, yet he could see the ripple effect of that choice spreading outward in ways he could no longer control. What Brad hadn't anticipated was the weight of guilt that followed. He knew he had crossed a line that could never be erased, that he had put his friendship with Britt at risk, and that if she discovered what he had done, she might never forgive him. But the fear, the relentless, suffocating fear that Jason's world would destroy her, was stronger than any guilt he carried. Every time he pictured Britt in danger, every time he imagined her crying in fear, every time he remembered the trembling in her voice during those nights she called him seeking comfort, Brad convinced himself he had done the right thing, even if it meant becoming the villain in Jason's eyes, even if it meant placing himself directly in the path of someone everyone else avoided. Yet as the days passed, Brad began to sense a shift in the air around him, as if the shadows themselves had grown sharper. Jason had not retaliated, had not confronted him further, had not even raised his voice. And somehow, that silence terrified Brad even more. Jason's restraint was a warning in itself, a reminder that consequences did not always come quickly, and that some debts collected interest before they were settled. Brad began to worry that he had awakened something he was not prepared to face, not anger, but watchfulness, a quiet calculation that could lead to something far worse if pushed. But even then, Brad refused to back down. The fear that Britt might get hurt kept him rooted in his decision, even as his own safety became uncertain. What Brad did not realize was that his attempt to protect Britt had set off a chain reaction. He could no longer influence. Britt could sense the tension, even if she didn't know its cause. Jason became more distant, more cautious, more conflicted, torn between the pull he still felt toward Britt and the danger Brad had forced him to acknowledge. And deep inside, Brad felt something unravel, a sense that he had stepped into a battlefield far larger and darker than he intended. He had hoped to save Britt from danger, yet by using Selina's secrets, he now risked dragging her into an entirely different one born not from Jason's enemies, but from Brad's own desperate choices. As the conflict simmered beneath the surface, Brad could no longer shake the realization that he might have made things worse, that the web of danger surrounding Britt was tightening. Not because of Jason alone, but because Brad had stepped into a role he wasn't prepared to play. He feared what Jason might do, feared what Selina might demand, feared what Britt might think once the truth came out. But more than anything, he feared that the distance growing between Jason and Britt was not a victory, but the beginning of a much larger storm he had unintentionally unleashed. And in the middle of that storm, Brad finally understood the harshest truth of all. His attempt to protect Britt had already gone too far, and now all he could do was brace himself for the consequences that might not spare anyone involved. Brad never intended for things to spiral this far, but once he opened the door, once he let those first fragments of information slip into Jason's hands, there was no turning back. What began as a desperate attempt to push Jason away from Britt had now grown into something much larger, far more dangerous. Something that reached far beyond the boundaries of Port Charles and into the hidden networks of people like Sidwell and Brennan. Brad didn't realize, not at first, that the secrets he carried were not simply personal leverage over Jason. They were clues, cracks in a much bigger, darker structure. And once Jason saw those cracks, he began to pry them open with the same relentless precision he used for every threat he had ever faced. Brad had merely wanted to save Britt from heartbreak or danger, but instead, he had whispered the kind of truth that could shift entire power balances in Port Charles. For weeks, rumors had circulated quietly through Selina's channels. Sidwell, the elusive financier with ties to off-record arms routes, had been moving in shadows closer to home. Brennan, cold, calculating, and viciously efficient, had resurfaced too, weaving himself back into corridors of influence after everyone believed he had disappeared. Brad had overheard Selina mention them, had caught hints of alliances so fragile, yet so volatile that even Selina tread carefully around them. At the time, he never imagined these fragments would matter to Jason, but fear had a way of twisting his judgment, and when he dug for ways to scare Jason away from Britt, he ended up giving Jason exactly what he needed: names, connections, and a pattern of movement that no one else had pieced together. And suddenly, Jason understood something Brad never did. Sidwell and Brennan were not just resurfacing, they were repositioning themselves. They were aligning with forces outside Port Charles, building channels that led directly into the kind of networks Jason had spent years dismantling. Brad's panicked attempt to manipulate him had instead given him the first clear thread in a web of concealed violence, corruption, and betrayal. The realization hit Jason hard, and once he understood the magnitude of what Brad had said, he felt an old instinct rise inside him, the instinct to protect, to intervene, to stop the next wave of destruction before it reached the people he cared about. But what unsettled him more was not the threat itself. It was the unmistakable pattern forming beneath it. Sidwell and Brennan weren't just moving independently. They were circling Sonny and Carly's orbit. They were probing the edges of the world Jason had once anchored with his presence, testing for weaknesses, looking for fractures caused by months of chaos and instability. Brad didn't know any of this. His warnings had been driven by emotion, not strategy. But Jason, with years of lived experience, knew the signs too well. Every detail Brad shared, every slip of information overheard from Selina, every name that crossed her desk became part of a map forming inside Jason's mind. A map that led straight to a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. Carly and Sonny were already entangled in something far beyond their control. They weren't simply targets, they had already stepped into a game they didn't fully understand. Jason felt a cold wave of dread settle into his chest as he pieced everything together. Sidwell's financial shadowing wasn't random. Brennan's reappearance in town wasn't coincidence. The strange patterns in Sonny's behavior, the way he had been increasingly volatile, unpredictable, utterly unlike the man Jason once knew, suddenly made horrifying sense. Someone had been pushing him, manipulating him, perhaps even drugging or destabilizing him from the inside. And Carly, in her relentless effort to hold everything together, had unknowingly walked right into Brennan's sphere of influence. She had reached out to people she shouldn't have trusted, made deals she didn't fully understand, all because she was desperate to protect Sonny from forces she couldn't see. Jason could feel the truth closing in around him, sharper and more suffocating with each passing hour. This wasn't just about danger, it was about control, calculated, psychological control. Sidwell and Brennan weren't just threatening Sonny and Carly physically. They were dismantling the very sense of stability that kept their empire intact. They were targeting Sonny's mind, Carly's instincts, their shared influence, their power. They were turning Port Charles into a silent battlefield where the weapons were manipulation, leverage, secret financial corridors, and slow, creeping destabilization. And now Jason, unintentionally pulled into the center of it all, had to confront the fact that Brad's desperate attempt to scare him off Britt had instead given him the one piece of information capable of blowing the entire operation open. A truth that made his heart pound in a way no physical threat ever did. This was bigger than mob wars, bigger than territorial disputes. This was orchestrated, methodical, and specifically designed to fracture everything Jason cared about. Brad watched this shift in Jason with growing fear. He had wanted to frighten Jason, to push him away, but he had never wanted this. Jason's expression no longer carried personal frustration, it carried focus, purpose. A coldness that Brad recognized from the old days just before a storm broke loose in Port Charles. And Brad understood, too late, that Jason had moved past Britt entirely in this moment. He was now calculating the threat around Carly and Sonny, the extent of the damage done, and the possibilities of who might die if he didn't intervene. Brad felt the weight of his mistake settle into his bones. He had opened a door that he wasn't strong enough to close. He had handed Jason the catalyst for a war he wasn't meant to be part of. And worst of all, He had exposed Britt to a level of danger beyond anything he originally feared, because now Jason would be pulled into Sidwell and Brennan's crosshairs, and anyone connected to him would be at risk. Jason, meanwhile, felt the slow burn of anger mixing with dread. Carly and Sonny were not just in trouble, they were losing control in ways they didn't even recognize. Their decisions had grown reckless. Their alliances had grown desperate. Their impulses unpredictable. Brennan and Sidwell had carved their way into the center of their stability, turning them into shadows of themselves. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt fear not for himself, but for the people he had once sworn to protect with his life. And as Brad stood there, watching Jason's realization settle into something terrifying, he understood that the information he delivered had now rewritten the entire future. The game had changed. The rules had changed. And Jason Morgan, dragged back into the war he tried to leave behind, was now standing at the threshold of a darkness deeper than any he had faced before, one that threatened not just him, but Britt, Carly, Sonny, and the fragile balance of Port Charles itself. Because Brad had revealed the truth, and there was no going back. Britt had always believed she could anticipate the storms in her life. She had weathered enough of them: medical crises, mob threats, family betrayals, her own mistakes, every wave carving new lines of survival into her heart. Yet nothing prepared her for the strange emotional collision unfolding in front of her. As she stood there, silently watching Brad confront Jason, she could feel the tension even before a single word was exchanged. An invisible pressure that seemed to thicken the air around them. The promotional clips made it look dramatic, almost explosive. But the real moment was far more complex, far more personal, far more dangerous in the subtle ways that only the heart could understand. Britt knew Brad better than anyone. She knew his fear, his loyalty, his instinct to cling to the people he loved, sometimes in ways that suffocated rather than protected. She recognized the flicker of panic in his eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers, the way he braced himself as if he were preparing to stop a runaway train. But what she didn't expect was the sharp, deeper ache rising inside her as she realized what he was actually doing. Brad wasn't just worried, he was interfering, stepping directly into a place that didn't belong to him. Her feelings, her heart, her choices, none of those were his to control. And yet, driven by fear, he had crossed that boundary anyway. There was a part of Britt that wanted to rush forward, to stop him, to pull him away before he said something he couldn't take back. But another part of her, the part that had spent years burying emotions under layers of cynicism and self-protection, froze in place. She wanted to hear what Brad would say. She wanted to see how Jason would react. She wanted to know what truths might slip out when fear was given too much room to breathe. Because deep inside her, beneath the surface of everything she pretended not to feel, she sensed that this moment was bigger than it looked. This wasn't just a friend trying to keep her safe. This was the beginning of a shift she had been avoiding for months. Her eyes drifted toward Jason, and instantly she regretted it. The expression on his face, the quiet intensity, the mixture of confusion and concern hit her with a force she didn't anticipate. Jason had always carried emotions differently from other men. He didn't shout. He didn't break down. He didn't flinch. Everything he felt lived behind his eyes, steady and unwavering. And in this moment Britt saw something she had hoped to never see again. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. Fear that she was being pulled into danger. Fear that he was causing it. Fear that he might lose her once more. For months she had been fighting against this pull between them, convincing herself that the connection they shared was a remnant of another life. One filled with stolen moments, dangerous escapes, late-night confessions, and that impossible sense of belonging she had never felt with anyone else. She had told herself she was done with all that. She had decided she needed stability, not chaos. She wanted safety, not heartache. She wanted a life that wouldn't be threatened every time someone said Jason Morgan's name. Yet now, standing mere feet away from him, watching his jaw tighten and his eyes darken as Brad delivered his warning, Britt felt every wall she had built over the past months begin to weaken. It was subtle at first, like the faint cracking of ice beneath pressure, but then it grew, spreading through her chest with a slow, painful warmth she didn't know how to stop. She still loved him. She had tried to deny it, to bury it, to starve it out. But love was a stubborn thing, especially the kind that didn't fade with distance or silence. The truth was simple, terrifying, and brutally undeniable. Jason had never stopped being a part of her heart. And now Brad, without realizing it, was tearing open everything she had worked so hard to keep buried. Brad's voice trembled with conviction as he warned Jason, his words thick with fear and desperation. Britt felt the sting of betrayal rise in her throat. Brad had no right to speak for her, no right to tell Jason what she could or could not handle. What hurt the most was knowing Brad was doing this because he cared about her. He loved her in his own way deeply, fiercely, irrationally, but love didn't justify intrusion. Love didn't excuse crossing a line so personal, so fragile, that even Britt herself hesitated to step over it. She wondered if Jason knew the turmoil raging inside her. She wondered if he sensed the emotional earthquake Brad had triggered. She wondered if he could see the way her hands shook, the way her breath had become shallow, the way her entire world felt as though it were tilting dangerously on its axis. The promotional clips suggested conflict, a dramatic confrontation, tension that could explode at any moment. But reality was far more complicated. This was not about anger, not yet. This was about fear, heartbreak, and the weight of choices that had haunted them both for far too long. Britt knew exactly what was happening inside Jason's mind. She had seen it before, in moments where he felt he was a danger to the people he loved. He would pull back, shut himself off, distance himself under the belief that he was protecting them. He had done it with Sam, with Carly, with so many others. And now Brad's warning might push him to do it again with her. The thought sent a sharp ache through her chest. She wondered if she should intervene, demand that Brad stop talking, stop projecting his fears onto her life, stop using his own panic as justification for stepping into something he didn't understand. But Britt also knew that silence was its own form of truth. If she stepped in too quickly, Jason might misinterpret her motives. If she stayed silent, Jason might misinterpret her fear. Everything in this moment balanced precariously on what she chose to reveal and what she chose to hide. The deeper question lingered like a shadow. Would this moment damage her friendship with Brad? Britt had forgiven Brad for so many things, but this was different. This wasn't a harmless mistake or a misguided decision. This was a direct intrusion into her most vulnerable space, a space she was already struggling to navigate on her own. If Brad's interference cost her the chance to reconnect with Jason, Britt wasn't sure she could forgive him. Love was complicated, fragile, and terrifying, but it was hers to choose, not Brad's to sabotage. And then came the greater fear, one that Britt had pushed aside, but now felt rising uncontrollably. What would Jason do with Brad's warning? Would he walk away again? Would he decide she deserved someone safer, someone untouched by violence and danger? Would he deny himself the chance to love her because he believed he was protecting her? The idea of losing him a second time made her stomach lurch. Jason and Britt had already survived so many obstacles: distance, danger, loss, denial. Fate had tried repeatedly to force them apart, and somehow they still found each other in the moments that mattered. But now Brad, intentionally or not, had placed himself directly between them. His warning had planted a seed of doubt, one that could grow into something far larger if left unchecked. In the days and weeks to come, this moment could become a breaking point. Brad's interference could spark misunderstandings, create emotional fractures, or revive the fears Britt had tried to suppress. He might unintentionally widen the divide between her and Jason, turning fear into hesitation, hesitation into distance, and distance into an entirely new heartbreak. But the opposite was also possible. Brad's warning might push Jason to fight harder, to choose Britt despite every danger, to confront the reality that he couldn't protect her by walking away from her. It might force Britt to finally confront her own feelings, to stop hiding behind walls built from past trauma, to admit she was still in love with him. The future was uncertain, precarious, filled with emotional landmines that any of them could trigger at any moment. But one truth echoed louder than anything else. Jason and Britt were standing on the edge of something real, something powerful, something that refused to disappear despite every attempt to bury it. And now, with Brad's warning reverberating between them, they would have to decide whether to let fear win once again, or finally step into the uncertain, dangerous, beautiful truth that had always connected them. Only time would reveal whether Brad had shattered everything or unintentionally pushed them toward a love neither of them could outrun.